To everybody, this is Bob Anderson. I'm talking to you from London. And today we're going to be discussing holes between the atrial chambers. I'm going to start off by discussing with you the extent of the atrial septum. Now, this may seem a little strange to you when we're going to be talking about septal defects, but what I'm going to be emphasizing to you is that not all of the channels that permit shunting between the atrial chambers are within the confines of the atrial septum. So that's why it is so crucial that I begin by explaining to you the extent of those components that separate the cavity of the right atrium from the cavity of the left atrium. What I am also going to do is I am going to review for you again the way the atrial chambers develop. Now, many of you may have been with us on a previous classroom when we discussed development of the atrial chambers. So I will review that information, concentrating on atrial septal development, and then I'll relate that to the morphology of holes between the atrial chambers. So I'm showing you here the picture of the opened right atrium. Coming in at the top, you see the opening of the superior caval vein. Coming in at the bottom, the opening of the inferior caval vein. And there is the mouth of the coronary sinus. So that is the landmark that dominates the posterior aspect of the morphologically right atrium, the oval fossa. And what I'm going to show you is that it is the floor of the oval fossa that is the largest part of the atrial septum. I'm also going to share with you many of the virtual dissections that have been made by my very good friend and colleague, Shumpei Mori. Shumpei is a clinical cardiologist. He's now working in Los Angeles, and he produces the most amazing pictures by making virtual dissections of computerized tomographic data sets. And this is one of his pictures, and it parallels the image I've just shown you of the autopsied heart. So you're looking at the image from the right side. Coming in at the bottom, the opening of the inferior caval vein. Coming in at the top, the opening of the superior caval vein. Shumpei also shows you the openings, or rather the locations of the right pulmonary veins that are obviously opening into the left atrial chamber. And there, as with the specimen, you see the opening of the coronary sinus. And Shumpei's virtual dissection, again emphasizing how it is the location of the oval fossa that dominates what we can now call the septal surface of the morphologically right atrium. What I'm going to be emphasizing is that anchoring the oval fossa to the plane of the atrioventricular junctions, and as you see from his virtual data sets shown in attitudinally appropriate fashion, the plane of the atrioventricular junction is more or less vertical. So I'm going to be emphasizing the importance of this anterior buttress, because what I will show you is that this is the strongest part of those structures that interpose between the cavities of the right and left atrial chambers. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about the rims of the oval fossa, and many times these are called the limbus of the oval fossa. But what I'm going to show you here, using Shumpei's exquisite virtual dissections, is that almost all of these limbs are not true septal structures. They are folds between the walls of the right atrium, the walls of the left atrium. And if you pass through those folds, then it's possible to get from the right atrium to the left atrium, but in so doing, you transgress on extracavitary space. And that is why I believe it is so important to distinguish between true septal structures, those parts that can be removed without exiting from the cavities of the chambers, as opposed to these folds. You can cross over the folds, you can get from the right atrium to the left atrium, but in so doing, you pass through the extracavitary space and you court the risk of producing cardiac tamponade. Now, I'm also going to show you many of the beautiful photographs of autopsied hearts that have been produced by my good friend and colleague, Diane Spicer. And this is a very interesting dissection that Diane has made, because she has taken away all those parts of the atrial walls except those parts that produce true septal entities between the right and left atrial chambers. And so what you can see that she's left behind the floor of the oval fossa. You can now see how she has isolated the buttress. And it is the buttress, as I've already said, that is anchoring the oval fossa against the plane of atrioventricular insulation. There you see the mouth of the coronary sinus, and by taking away the walls that are not true septal structures, Diane has isolated the mouth of the coronary sinus, because it is the termination of the cavity of the sinus that runs through the left atrioventricular groove. There you see the tendon of Todaro. This, of course, is one of the landmarks to the triangle of Koch. And what you see here is that it runs through another area that is not truly septal. We call it the sinus septum. We also call it the eustachian ridge. But in reality, this is the fold between the opening of the coronary sinus, the opening of the inferior caval vein, and what you see from Diane's dissection is that the fibroadipose tissue filling that fold runs further towards the buttress, which is a true septal entity. But what Diane's dissection shows you most beautifully is that everywhere else, between the walls of the right atrium, the walls of the rest of the heart, there are areas filled by fibroadipose tissue. I've just highlighted the inferior pyramidal space, and that is part of the atrioventricular muscular sandwich. But what we're particularly concerned with now is the rims of the oval fossa. So posteriorly, we have a fold that is between the back wall of the fossa, the inferior of the right pulmonary veins. To the top, we have another fold, the superior interatrial groove, and that is interposing between the connection of the superior caval vein and the right superior pulmonary vein. And then we come to the groove that separates the anterior wall of the atrial chambers from the aortic root, and that again is extracavitary space. So to understand the anatomy of the atrial septum, we need to distinguish between the true septal entities and the folds that surround the oval fossa. And Shumpei has made it possible for us to understand that by more of his virtual dissections. So you'll recognize again, we're looking at the heart from the right side, and dominating the posterior wall of the morphologically right atrium, we see the oval fossa. To the top and anterior, we find the aortic root. And a crucial relationship between the rims of the oval fossa and the extracavitary entities is this relationship with the aortic root. There you see the mouth of the coronary sinus with the prominent subthebesian recess beneath it. And what we can now show you is the nature of these rims of the oval fossa, because Shumpei has created a series of virtual dissections. So you see this one is going from top to bottom, from the opening of the superior caval vein into the opening of the inferior caval vein. Shumpei has rotated that through 90 degrees, So now you are standing at the back of the heart and you're looking at that section, so that the right side is seen to your right hand, the left side is seen to your left hand. And on that basis, you will appreciate that we see there the left atrium, the vestibule leading down to the orifice of the mitral valve. To your right hand, you see the opening of the right atrium really leading down to the vestibule, which is feeding into the tricuspid valve. And so now to the top, you see the opening of the superior caval vein, to the bottom, the opening of the inferior caval vein. And now I think that Schumpe's virtual dissection shows you quite beautifully how, bordering the oval fossa, to the top we have an extensive fold between the attachment of the superior caval vein to the right atrium, the attachment of the superior right pulmonary vein to the left atrium. And look at the extent of that superior interatrial fold. The surgeons know they can dissect within this fold, and they call that Waterston's groove or Sondergaard's groove, and that gives them very good access, if they dissect in there, to the dome of the left atrium. We can also see that inferiorly, the rim of the oval fossa again is a fold, this time between the opening of the inferior caval vein and the walls of the left atrium. So let's return to Schumpe's data set and let's make another cut. This time moving from the front to the back and cutting through the aortic root, because this is going to show us the key relationship between the oval fossa and the aortic root. So now we've taken Schumpe's cut and we're looking down on it from above. So this time, again, we see the morphologically left atrium to the left hand. To the top, you see the opening of the left atrial appendage. Beneath and to the right, we see the inferior, the floor of the morphologically right atrium. And here is the connection to the right ventricle. And then we see the infundibulum wrapping itself around the aortic root making up the centerpiece of the heart. So now when we put in the oval fossa, we see that it is behind and inferior to the aortic root. Once more we see anterosuperiorly a fold. The rim is a fold between the walls of the right atrium, the walls of the left atrium, and inferiorly and posteriorly, again, a fold. The rims of the fossa all the way around, except anteriorly, are folds. So let's look at that key anterior border of the oval fossa. And this time, we can look at it by creating the section that the echocardiographers call the four-chamber section. So you see that the cut is moving from the back to the front of the heart. And when we show it to you in attitudinally appropriate fashion, we put the right-sided structures to the front, we put the left-sided structures to the back. When the echocardiographers show us this section, of course, they rotate the heart through 90 degrees so that the heart itself is positioned on its apex. But you all know full well that is not how the heart lies when it is normally positioned within the chest. And now we try to display to you the anatomy as it is seen with the heart in attitudinally appropriate fashion. So again, we see the oval fossa, and this time we can see the location of that key anterior buttress. And this is a true second septal component. And it anchors the oval fossa, as you see in this very nice virtual dissection, to the plane of atrioventricular insulation. But posteriorly, once more, we have a fold. Now we can confirm the validity of Schumpe's virtual dissections by showing you what we find when we cut a heart in comparable fashion and we show it to you in attitudinally appropriate fashion. So this is another of Diane Spicer's exquisite pictures showing you the anatomy and confirming that what Schumpe has revealed is indeed the real thing. So to the back, we see the smooth walls of the left atrium. On the floor of the right atrium, we see the opening of the inferior cable vein. And now we can see that attaching and anchoring the ovifossa to the plane of atrioventricular insulation, we have this extensive anterior buttress. And this is the strongest part of the rims of the ovifossa. It is a true second septal component, and it anchors the floor of the ovifossa to the atrioventricular junction. Now, most times what people call the second septum is either the posterior fold or the superior interatrial fold. As Diane's dissection shows you, confirming what Schumpe has shown us already, these are not true septal structures. They are no more than folds filled with fibroadipose tissue. We can get across them from the cavities of the right atrium to the left atrium, but in so doing, we transgress an extracavitary space, emphasizing the need to distinguish between true septal structures, the floor of the ovifossa, its anterior buttress, and the rims, which elsewhere are made of folds. So that is the anatomy of the atrial septum. Now, does knowledge of its development help us to understand the lesions we're going to be discussing that produce interatrial communications? And now I think it does. I think we've learned so much now about the knowledge of development that we can truly provide those insights and show you which of the channels are true septal defects as opposed to those other communications that exist now outside the confines of the atrial septum. So I'm going to summarize the information that was made available from the reconstructed data sets made by my good friend Wout Lammers and his associate Jill Hickspoors, working in the University of Maastricht, a series of human embryos showing us the state of development from Carnegie stage 10, 4 to 5 weeks of human development, up to Carnegie stage 23, 7 to 8 weeks of human development. So here I'm showing you the vascular channels at the start of cardiac development when we first see a heart tube. So there in purple, you see the reconstruction of the venous channels that are coming back from the placenta. In gray, you see the venous channels formed on the surface of the yolk sac. And it is these venous tributaries that come together and form the inlets to the developing heart tube. But the heart tube itself at this stage, which is more or less linear, we know will form little more than the eventual left ventricle. And this is derived from what we now call the first or the primary heart field. But already new material is being added to the developing heart from what we call the second heart field. And we see already that at the cranial part of the intrapericardial components, we have the outflow tract. And when the outflow tract reaches the area of the aortic sac, it gives rise to 2 ventral aortas. So this is the early stage when we begin to see formation of the heart. Very soon, at the next stage of so-called Carnegie development, we see that there has been a change in that ventricular component. We see that the venous tributaries have now come together caudally, forming what we call the hepatocardiac channels. They are now draining back in confluent fashion the blood that is coming from the yolk sac, the blood that's coming from the placenta, and they come together to form the venous tributaries. But also now we're beginning to see the venous tributaries developing within the embryo itself. The major change, however, has taken place in the ventricular component because further tissue has been added to the heart at the venous pole, forming what we can now recognize at the start of the atrial chambers. We can see the communication between those atrial chambers and the ventricular component, and that has also lengthened, giving us the outflow tract and forming what we can now call the ventricular loop. And as I explained in one of the previous classrooms when we discussed ventricular development, we know that from that ventricular loop, from the inlet forms the apical component of the left ventricle, from the outlet, the apical component of the right ventricle. And what we'll see very shortly is that at this early stage, the developing atrial chambers connect only to the left ventricle, whilst the outflow tract is supported exclusively from the developing right ventricle. So let's turn that reconstruction round and let's look at the stage of the atrial component at this early stage. We see the venous tributaries coming back, as I've already emphasized, the umbilical veins draining the placenta, the vitelline veins draining the yolk sac. They are now confluent on each side, and we can now call these the sinus horns. And the sinus horns now receive not only the hepatocardiac channels, but also on each side, they receive the venous tributaries from the embryo itself, the cardinal veins. And they now all come together into the venous component, the caudal component of the developing heart tube. As I say, we can now recognize these inlets as the horns of the systemic venous sinus. But what we see now is that each horn is connected to the newly developed atrial body that has come into the pericardial cavity from the second heart field, and it then balloons from its ventral component the cavities of what eventually will become the appendages. And this is the atrioventricular canal, this early stage, connecting only to the developing left ventricle. So now, at Carnegie stage 12, the key point is that those venous tributaries are developing in symmetrical fashion. Right side of the developing atrial chamber, the left side to the left half of the developing atrial chamber. So if we are going to septate that atrial chamber, a key point is to shift those venous tributaries so that they open only to the right side of that primary component of the developing atrial part of the heart. And we see that happens very rapidly from the 12th to the 13th stages as listed in the Carnegie catalog. So here, looking at it from behind, we see the situation in a human embryo, a reconstruction of a human embryo at about 5 weeks of development, Carnegie stage 13. You'll recognize again the venous tributaries, but they're all now emptying into the systemic venous sinus, which has moved so as to open only to the right side of the atrial component of that primary heart tube. And now the left sinus horn, receiving on the left side the umbilical vein, the vitelline vein, and the veins from the embryo itself, is being incorporated into what will become the left atrioventricular junction. So the systemic venous sinus is now opening only to the right side of the body, the primary heart tube, which will become the atrial chambers. That body is still connected to the pharyngeal mesenchyme itself through the dorsal mesocardium. And it is this dorsal mesocardium that we can also call the heart tube, which gives the option for the pulmonary vein, which will canalize as a midpharyngeal strand and open into the developing atrial chamber. We can confirm that that is going on by looking at one of the episcopic images prepared from a human embryo. Now we're looking at it from the front. So you see the developing right half of the primary atrial component to your left hand. You see the developing left half of the primary atrial chamber to your right hand. And now you see how that left sinus horn has become incorporated into what eventually will become the left atrioventricular junction. And now, together with all the other venous tributaries, it is opening into the systemic venous sinus, and you see that the boundaries of the systemic venous sinus are now marked by what we call the venous valves. And what you can also see very clearly is that now they are opening only to the right side of the atrial component of the primary heart tube. So now, when the primary atrial septum grows from the roof of that primary component, it is able to grow in such a way as to put the systemic venous sinus into the right side, leaving the pulmonary vein that will canalize and open through the dorsal mesocardium, opening to eventually what will become the left atrium. So it is transfer, this rightward transfer of the systemic venous tributaries along with the systemic venous sinus to what will be eventually the morphologically right atrium that sets the scene for septation. So how then is the atrial chamber septated? Well, now I'm showing you a section, a histologic section through the developing heart. This is the equivalent of what we would call a 4-chamber section. It's one stage later than I showed you just a moment in the reconstruction. To your left hand, you see right atrium. To your right hand, left atrium. Still at this early stage, the atrioventricular canal connects exclusively to what eventually will become the left ventricle. But you can see that the ventricular component itself is looped, and this is part of the developing right ventricle, and that is supporting at this stage the outflow tract. But look into the roof of the atrial component of the heart tube. And now we can see budding out from that roof, we see the myocardium of what will become the primary atrial septum. But note also that covering over the primary septum, we have this mesenchymal cap. And it is the primary septum that will grow towards the atrioventricular canal, where we find further mesenchymal structures, which we call the atrioventricular cushions. And I can show you that if we take a similar 4-chamber section through a developing mouse heart. Now, this is a little more advanced than the stage I showed you just a moment ago in the human heart. Again, it's what we would call a 4-chamber section. Very nicely there, you see the venous valves, which mark the boundary between the systemic venous sinus, developing atrial component, and you see that the systemic venous sinus is opening to the right half of the primary atrial component. So now you can see how the primary septum is growing towards the atrioventricular canal. It's broken down at the roof, giving us what we will call the secondary interatrial foramen. Why secondary atrial foramen? Because now between the mesenchymal cap and the atrioventricular cushions that themselves are dividing the atrioventricular canal into right and left hearts, we have the primary atrial foramen. And eventually, by ongoing growth of the primary atrial septum, the embryo will close that primary foramen, leaving the secondary foramen, whereby the blood from the placenta can get into the left side of the developing heart. And we can track closure of the primary foramen through our episcopic data sets. So here, a little later on embryonic day 11.5 in the mouse, we can see ongoing growth of the muscular primary septum with its mesenchymal cap, and as it gets closer towards the inferior atrioventricular cushions, so the primary foramen becomes smaller. But now you can also see another key player that is key to producing what I have called the buttress of the atrial septum. And that is this spine that is growing into the back of the heart from the pharyngeal mesenchyme. And we call this the vestibular spine because it was first described a very long time ago. Here you see the growth of the primary atrial septum, and there is the spine growing exactly as I showed you in that episcopic data set, but this time in a drawing that we have copied from the work of Wilhelm His the Elder, the father of the man who described the bundle, the consummate embryologist of the 19th century, and it was as long ago as 1865 that His described the significance of this vestibular spine. Because what we can now confirm from our data sets is that as the spine continues to grow, it fuses with the inferior cushion, with the mesenchymal cap on the leading edge of the primary septum, and in so doing, it commits the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. So if we move on a little bit, and we can see the stage now at which the atrioventricular cushions have separated the atrioventricular canal into the tricuspid and mitral valve orifices, we can see how the primary septum, with its mesenchymal cap, fused with the superior cushion, which in turn was fused with the inferior cushion. But we can also now see very beautifully how the vestibular spine has reinforced the right side of that area of unity, thus binding the primary atrial septum onto the atrioventricular cushions that will form the insulating atrioventricular plane. And we can confirm that when we look at a situation subsequent to the completion of septation, the human embryo here at about 9 weeks of development. And now we can see the primary septum forming the floor of the ovifossa, and those components that form the buttress, the vestibular spine, the mesenchymal cap, have now muscularized and bound the primary septum to the insulating plane derived from the atrioventricular cushions. You see that by now the pulmonary venous component is migrating to the roof of the atrium, and only at this stage do we see that superior interatrial fold. It is not a true septum, it is a fold between the connections of the pulmonary veins to the left atrium and the walls of the right atrium. So let me summarize for you atrial septal development. We start with moving the systemic venous sinus to the right. And we remember that the primary atrial component of the heart tube is anchored to the pharyngeal mesenchyme by the heart stalk, the dorsal mesocardium. The atrioventricular cushions are separating the atrioventricular canal. And now, as the primary septum with its mesenchymal cap grows from the atrial roof, it has the systemic venous sinus to its right side. And the space between the mesenchymal cap, the atrioventricular cushions, is the primary foramen. So as the primary foramen grows towards the cushions, so the pulmonary vein canalizes and opens through the heart stalk, the dorsal mesocardium, and the growth of the primary septum towards the atrioventricular cushions reduces the dimensions of the primary foramen. As the primary foramen becomes smaller, so perforations occur at the roof of the atrium to give us the secondary interatrial foramen. And that is the space between the primary septum and the atrial roof. And it is necessary because when the mesenchymal cap fuses with the inferior cushion to close the primary septum, we still need an interatrial communication, and that is provided by the cranial breakdown of the primary septum. And now it is the growth of the vestibular spine which anchors the primary septum to the atrioventricular cushions, giving us the definitive arrangement. So with now the oval fossa giving us the opening to the secondary foramen, the floor of the oval fossa is the primary septum, the muscularized spine and cap form the buttress, and then the so-called septum secundum is in reality the superior interatrial fold. And it is on the basis of those developmental processes that now I can distinguish for you true septal defects, those that are found within the oval fossa, including persistent patency of the oval foramen, a much rarer type, which may be new to you, vestibular defect. Those are really within the septal components, as opposed to the other channels that permit an interatrial communication, but are outside the confines of the septum: sinus venosus defect, coronary sinus defect, and the ostium primum defect. So let's start with the simple ones. These are easy to understand, and we'll begin with persistent patency of the oval foramen. And I can show you that most beautifully with this exquisite photograph taken by Diane Spicer. We're looking down on the base of the ventricular mass from above. And as I've shown you, to your left hand, you see the mouth of the mitral valve, the left atrium. To your right hand, you see the vestibule of the tricuspid valve, the right atrium. And there you see the margins of the oval fossa. And this picture shows you exquisite the anatomy of persistent patency of the oval foramen. The primary septum is forming the floor of the oval fossa, and it is overlapping the anterior interatrial fold. But there is now a tunnel that exists between the flap valve, the rims of the oval foramen, because although the flap valve is of sufficient dimensions to overlap the rims, it has not actually fused with the rims. And this is why we get persistent patency of the oval foramen. It is a tunnel rather than a simple hole. It's found in up to 1/3 of the normal population, and as long as left atrial pressure is higher than right atrial pressure, it will not create problems, because the hemodynamics of the persistently patent oval foramen. Problems exist when we have defects within the oval fossa, and they can exist either because the flap valve, the primary atrial septum, is deficient, or else it is fenestrated. So please remember, these defects within the oval fossa are due to deficiencies of the floor. The floor is derived from the primary atrial septum, so they are ostium secundum defects rather than septum secundum defects. And here we see such an ostium secundum defect. Another of Diane's very beautiful pictures. In passing, you can also see that there's a muscular defect of the inlet part of the ventricular septum, but this is our focus, the oval fossa. And you see very beautifully here that the floor of the oval fossa, which is derived from the primary atrial septum, is of insufficient dimensions to block off the rims of the oval fossa. So that's why we have an ostium secundum defect, a defect within the oval fossa. And of course, should the floor of the fossa be fenestrated rather than simply deficient, you can have multiple holes between the right and left side, as you see here, a fenestrated primary septum forming the floor of the oval fossa, giving the potential for multiple holes, multiple pathways across the oval fossa between the cavities of the right and left atrial chambers. So fenestration can produce the same effect as can deficiencies of that primary septum. Now there is a second true defect of the primary atrial septum, and this one is much rarer. It's what we call the vestibular defect, and it's a hole within the anteroinferior buttress. And this beautiful picture of Diane is showing you such a vestibular defect. Again, in this instance, we have a fenestrated floor of the oval fossa, perforated flap valve. There is the mouth of the coronary sinus. But in this heart, there is also a big hole in that buttress, which normally would anchor the oval fossa to the plane of atrioventricular junctions. And Diane has now looked at a large number of hearts, and she finds these vestibular defects in almost 1/20 of those that she's looking at. And we can now explain why they exist. You will remember this picture. I showed you the completion of septation in the mouse, the primary septum with its mesenchymal cap, vestibular spine, anchoring the primary septum to the insulating plane formed by the atrioventricular cushions. And we now know that the vestibular defect reflects inappropriate fusion between the vestibular spine and the mesenchymal cap, because we have found such defects in some of the mice that we've been exploring using this technique of episcopic microscopy. And here you see such a vestibular defect. There is the oval fossa. There is the muscularized vestibular spine. There, the muscularized mesenchymal cap. And just there, you see a vestibular defect over and above the secondary foramen seen at the roof of the atrial chambers. So let me now move on and tell you about those channels which are outside the confines of the atrial septum. And the obvious one is the sinus venosus defect. And it is not a septal defect, it is a veno-venous malformation. And its phenotypic feature is anomalous connection of one or more of the pulmonary veins that retain its or their left atrial connections. We can compare that by looking at simple partially anomalous pulmonary venous connection. Look at this specimen viewed from the front and from the right side. The right lower pulmonary veins are connecting normally. In this specimen, we have partially anomalous pulmonary venous connection, the right upper pulmonary vein to the superior caval vein. And what I want you to look at is the location of the junction between this anomalous vein and the superior caval vein, and compare it with this arrangement in a heart with a sinus venosus defect. Look at the site of the oval fossa. Again, the right lower pulmonary veins are connecting to the left atrium. The right upper pulmonary veins, exactly where I showed you just a moment ago, but this time they have created a defect between the cavities of the right and left atrial chambers that is well removed from the superior margin of the oval fossa, showing us that it is extraseptal. And we explain this by knowing that it is outside the confines of the true septum. We know the flap valve forms the floor, the muscularized spine and cap form the buttress, the roof is the infolded rim, the so-called secondary septum, but truly a fold. And we now know that if a pulmonary vein drains anomalously to a superior caval vein, but retains its left atrial connection, it will create an extraseptal veno-atrial conduit, overriding in many instances the superior rim of the oval fossa, leaving behind a normal arrangement of the primary septum. So what about coronary sinus defects? They are also extraseptal, and they are holes that exist through the mouth of the normal coronary sinus, usually found with persistence of the left superior caval vein. And we know from examination of lots of hearts that there is a spectrum from fenestration of the sinus to complete unroofing. We used to think we could explain this on the basis of a wall that was common to the coronary sinus in the left atrium. But we now know that is not the case. The coronary sinus has its own wall. We can see that from the outset of development, as we see in this picture of a developing human heart. There you see the left atrium. At this stage, the left sinus horn has yet completely to ameliorate, But if we blow up the space between, then we see that both the left sinus horn and the left atrium have their own walls with a space between them. And somehow these walls disappear as the left sinus horn becomes unroofed. And when it becomes unroofed, as you see in this specimen looked at from the left side, there is the opening of the left superior cable vein. It's now draining exclusively into the cavity of the left atrium. The oval fossa is intact, and that shows us that the mouth of the coronary sinus is now functioning as an interatrial communication, once more outside the confines of the oval fossa. And it does so because the walls that normally would separate the left sinus horn from the cavity of the left atrium have disappeared during development. And on occasion, we can see remnants of those walls, as you see here. This time we're looking from the inside of the left atrium, and this is showing us that the coronary sinus defect is no more than a spectrum moving from fenestration of the coronary sinus into the cavity of the left atrium to its complete unroofing, permitting the mouth of the coronary sinus to function as, again, an extra-septal interatrial communication. And to complete the set of extra-septal communications, we have the ostium primum defect. This time, in fact, it is a true septal defect, but it is not an atrial septal defect. It is an atrioventricular septal defect. In the setting of the ostium primum defect, we have shunting across the atrioventricular septal defect only at atrial level, and that is because the bridging leaflets of the common atrioventricular valve are attached to each other, and also they are fused to the crest of the muscular ventricular septum. And in the classroom that I will be giving you next week, I will discuss with you the specifics of atrioventricular septal defect. But for today, we can summarize what we've learned about interatrial defects. Most importantly, we should distinguish between those that are true septal defects, as opposed to those that are interatrial communications outside the confines of the atrial septum. So the true atrial septal defects are those within the oval fossa, ostium secundum defects, if you will, but remember they exist because of deficiency of the primary atrial septum. That rare second defect, vestibular defect, you won't notice that unless you know what you are looking for. But then these other communications, the sinus venosus defect, coronary sinus defect, the ostium primum defect, they all permit shunting between the atrial chambers, but outside the confines of the true septum. So that is our review of interatrial defects. If you join us again in the classrooms that will follow in this series, we will discuss next week atrioventricular septal defects, and then we will continue with a consideration of ventricular septal defects. So thank you for being with me, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.